Hey class, it's Miss Barnett. I am very excited to teach the lesson to you today on YouTube. Wait, what? What is on my head? Get off of my head. Oh, wait a second. I know what those are. Those are fairy tale birds. They must be here because I'm going to teach a lesson about fairy tales and what makes a fairy tale today. So let's get started. The first thing that we need to know is that fairy tales are fiction. That means fake. Just like the birds above my head, they are make-believe, they are not real, they are fake. Another thing that makes fairy tales different than other stories is that many of them begin with once upon a time. Not all of them, but many of the stories do. Another thing that makes fairy tales different than other kinds of stories is that they have good characters versus evil characters. Good characters versus evil characters. Good characters versus evil characters. And you might have noticed something there. I just said that 3 times because 3 is another fairy tale feature. That's right, the number 3 appears in many fairy tales. There are 3 little pigs, there are 3 bears, there are 3 bowls of porridge, 3 beds, 3 chairs, and 3 wishes. In many fairy tales, you'll find that number 3. Another number that you'll commonly see is the number 7. For example, there are 7 dwarves in Snow White. When you are watching a movie that has a fairy tale, that's about a fairy tale, or you're reading a fairy tale story, make sure you pay close attention to see if those numbers 3 and 7 appear in that story. Another thing that is very special about fairy tales is that many of them have magic. That's right, just like in Cinderella, the fairy godmother comes and takes a pumpkin and turns it into a coach. She takes Cinderella's raggedy clothes and turns them into a beautiful ball gown. The fairy godmother and her magic are very important to making the story possible and making Cinderella be able to win. Another thing that is very, very, very important about fairy tales that differentiates it from other stories, especially nonfiction, realistic fiction, and fables, is that always in fairy tales, the good character lives happily ever after. He or she has a happy ending, and that is something that is specific to a fairy tale. The bad character usually dies or disappears. That's right, that bad character, that evil character that we talked about, never bothers the good character ever again. And that happens only in fairy tales. In every single one. Now, you might say, Miss Barnett, I don't know how to do magic, and I don't have birds and animals that talk to me. How do fairy tales relate to my life? Well, all fairy tales teach a lesson, and that's how they relate to you. When you are reading a fairy tale story, you should be, by the very end, learn something from it. For example, 3 Little Pigs, I can relate to that story. I'm not a pig, and I'm not being chased by a wolf who's trying to eat me. But what I can learn is that the 3rd little pig worked very hard building his house. He spent the most time out of all the pigs. The first 2 pigs didn't work hard enough, and they weren't able to protect themselves. But that 3rd pig built that house out of bricks and took a lot of time and was careful when building, and he was able to save his family because of that hard work. So what I take away from the story is that if you work hard, you can protect your family and yourself. Now, lastly, before I sign off, I'd like to encourage you and your family to look up on YouTube or on Raz Kids or just Google to see if there are any fairy tales that might interest you. See if any of these fairy tale features appear in the story that you read. Also, there are Cinderella stories from all over the world, and there are fairy tales from all over the world. Maybe see if there's a fairy tale that's from your culture, because that's something that is a really interesting and cool thing about fairy tales that's different than other stories. For example, there are Cinderella stories that take place in the United States, in Mexico, in Africa, in Egypt, all over the world. So maybe you can find a Cinderella story that relates to you. And before you say, Miss Barnett, I don't like princesses and I don't want to learn about a ball. Well, there are Cinderella stories that have many different characters and meanings in them. For example, in the Irish Cinderlad, which takes place in Ireland, the main character is a boy who fights a dragon. It's totally different than a Cinderella story that you might be familiar with. Another one that's a Cinderella story that I love is called Like Mike, which is about it's a movie about a boy who gets a magic pair of Michael Jordan shoes and is able to play basketball really well. As long as these Cinderella stories have the fairy tale features that I just explained to you, it becomes a Cinderella story. So I encourage you to look some different ones up and see if there's one that catches your eye and your attention. Thanks for listening, and I will talk to you guys soon. Bye-bye!